All right. Yeah, and hi and welcome to this evening session, maybe this night session, depending on your time zone, to our workshop on how to be an anti-racist researcher. This is our second presentation of the context series, which focuses on inclusion, equity, and most importantly, or at least definitely in equal importance, is justice in research. So this particular session will be focusing, as the title of it suggests, on anti-racism and how we can apply that as researchers and even as evidence-based practitioners. I'm one of your facilitators for tonight's session, Matthew Chase, and joining me also is Esther Garcia. We're both librarians at the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences, and we'll also provide a little bit more information about ourselves in just a moment. But yeah, so at any point in this presentation, even though it is kind of formatted like a presentation in the sense that we are going to be providing information about this very important topic, what we do want to stress though is that this type of topic and theme is really a conversation. It's still being in development, you know, as we provide more ideas and strategies and really sharing knowledge with each other in that sense. So with that, we definitely encourage your own participation whenever you see fit. You can always unmute yourself at any point during the presentation and maybe chime in with your own clarification or perspective or questions, anything that you would like to provide to this whole dialogue. And I think Esther and I will kind of be bouncing off each other as well in that sense too. And you can also go through the chat option. Definitely feel free if you prefer that way. We'll definitely be monitoring that and answering any questions or again any comments you would like to provide.
Absolutely, and I would like to say that even though it is like Matthew said in presentation mode, everybody is their own expert, and we definitely think that y'all are experts in ways that we are not.
Well said. Yeah, love that. So yeah, so with that, I guess we can move on to another housekeeping type of deal that we have here, which is about the current contest that's being held for iLearn. So now with the launch of iLearn and all the assortment of events, including this one, students, current students specifically, are eligible to enter this contest where you can win one of 6 gift cards, or at least you have the chance to win one. And if I believe correctly, as the description here shows, is that with each event you attend, you kind of increase your chances. So one of the things to stress on your end is just to make sure that the screen name that is displaying on Ring Central is actually showing your last and first name. This is one of the ways that we kind of take your attendance in that sense and then enter you into the contest for that chance to win something big. So, but yeah, and I believe the announcement of like who wins will be sometime in April. But yeah, so with that, we can move forward. If you have any questions about actually renaming yourself or have any issues with that, feel free to let us know and we can definitely help you out before you leave tonight. So yeah, another thing just to kind of state, and I think as Esther kind of indicated, is that we're all kind of our own experts and we all come in with different interests, different backgrounds, different experiences and realities that we kind of all navigate as we're going to be talking about, especially when it comes to anti-racism and really connecting that to the overall theme of intersectionality, which we'll kind of dive a little bit into. We actually had a session earlier last month. No, actually this month. Sorry, my sense of time is off. But essentially, we do want to provide a little bit of disclosure about ourselves because ultimately, even though we're kind of presenting ourselves, or at least kind of positioned in the sense of like presenting information to you as an authority, ultimately our authority, our sense of knowledge is still shaped by like our position, by our experiences, by our own identities. And so this is one kind of way where we can provide that type of transparency to you so you can really evaluate our own authority and the credibility of our information and kind of seeing where you can fill any gaps that we might be missing, or really building upon what we're hoping to share. So with that, again, my name is Matthew Chase. I'm the librarian specifically at the San Marcos campus. I do have a academic background, not only in librarianship, obviously, but also in sociological practice. So that's mainly where my interests lie, especially when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and a lot of the information I'll be sharing, especially when it comes to theoretical backgrounds, when it comes to anti-racist frameworks and critical race theory. But that'll be coming in a bit. I also want to stress, yeah, I am a white USian, so I am an occupant of the United States in that sense. And also I'm a cisgender male, heterosexual, heteromantic. Also abbreviated is cishet, which I found out fairly recently, and I really like the abbreviation because it's a lot easier to say rather than cisgender male, heterosexual, heteromantic. And then also my pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a critical optimist. And basically I kind of wanted to put that out there mainly as a disclosure of also my approach to all of this, in the sense that I'm an optimist and that I do believe things can get better in the world and in our society. And nothing's just necessarily fixed or the way it is, or just as nature intended. Essentially, we can work towards better, right? But I also wanted to stress the critical part in the sense of like, what do we mean by getting better? Like, who's deciding that? How are we measuring that? And ultimately, who is really receiving the benefits of that quote unquote better? So in that sense, that's why I put critical optimist. But yeah, before I move on, Esther, was there anything you wanted to share on your end?
Yes, hi. So just in the same disclosure, cisgender, heteromantic as well. She, her pronouns. I am from the Latinx population, self-identified Chicana, and first generation American.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So with that, I guess we'll move on to the main event, which is really learning about how do we become anti-racist researchers. And really that question is going to not necessarily be fully answered even by the end of this workshop. This workshop is definitely not intended to be a one and done. You'll now know how to be an anti-racist researcher. We're still learning about that. And really this is kind of like an introduction into the themes of being an anti-racist researcher, how you can actually apply certain strategies and really developing answers for yourself. Really kind of applying that whole idea that we are all experts and we're all emerging experts in this sense. So really, we're not going to be providing all the information that will solve every issue that you'll probably encounter as a researcher, especially when it comes to equity and justice. But hopefully we'll help provide some guiding principles to kind of to build on. And this is actually, I believe you chose this quote, right, Esther? If you wanna,
It's always important in anti-racist work to give credit to the people who have come up with a lot of this terminology. And it's actually a lot of women of color that have come up with terms like anti-racist researcher or intersectionality. And so you'll see like places like academia weaponize these terms to keep other people out. So I just wanted to bring it back to Angela Davis, who wrote that who said that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. And by her saying that, it made it so that it's not passive, always active. always moving forward.
Love it. Yeah, I really enjoyed that you shared this particular quote. Especially, I think it really sets the tone of this whole workshop and even beyond it, in the sense that, like, even by being anti-racist, I think one of the things we need to stress is, like, it's not a label that we can put on ourselves, a title that we can somehow achieve. It's really an ongoing practice. It's always going to be something we have to work towards, and it probably won't stop. We just need to keep going. There won't be necessarily a full end, like a full end product of being anti-racist. Hopefully, maybe in the future, that is the ideal. But at this moment, we just need to keep going and really exploring what that means. And also, as Esther kind of was talking about, especially those intersections between race and ethnicity with other identities and other sites of privilege and oppression, like gender, sexuality, social class, and even where you live, geographical location, and so on. So we really need to consider all those really complex entanglements. So really, to be anti-racist is also to be like a feminist, to be also approaching things about,
to be active,
yeah,
to
exactly.
be thinking, to be considering, to be looking at angles. And I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Walt Whitman is, it's a multifaceted world. That's not exactly the quote, but we contain multitudes
Mm-hmm.
and we must embrace those. And so we might contradict ourselves, as Walt Whitman said, but we can't be scared to be contradicting ourselves. We have to be active.
Yeah, definitely. And even to that, like, it's okay to be feeling vulnerable in that sense. Like, maybe some of us might be feeling that. I know I definitely did when I was starting to kind of really dive into these topics, especially with the background and identities that I carry. Like, there was that sense of, like, having to really interrogate where I am positioned at as a researcher, as a person, and even as a practitioner, as a librarian even. So for sure. But that's also the exciting part, is that we're really kind of exploring things together in that sense, really kind of treading new waters in that sense. Cool. So with that, we also wanted to kind of, briefly contextualize. I think there's a lot of information when we dive into this part, but really when we wanted to kind of give some context as to why it's even important to really consider these issues, especially as health sciences practitioners, like many of you are or currently are trying to work towards becoming, but even for us as well as librarians, in the sense that we all have some role to play to really examine and really address these types of issues. So we have a couple systemic issues that we kind of wanted to highlight in the sense of, like, say, like how racial discrimination has been significantly associated with depression and anxiety among African American youth. So even how mental health, which is often kind of framed as a very individualized type of problem, something that an individual would have, is really connecting, though, mental health with racism in such a strong and powerful way. And also how, like, Black patients typically receive poorer treatment across patient-centeredness, contextual knowledge, and patient-provider communication from healthcare providers due to implicit bias. So even when we don't necessarily realize it or necessarily acknowledge it, we may be playing some part, big or small, in that sense, towards those type of experiences. And also with racial residential segregation, which is definitely still a real thing, a very significant thing, has increased, or it can increase, risks of adverse birth outcomes for Black mothers. So again, connecting how even health, our own well-being, which is often, again, kind of describes as a very individual, very personal thing, being connected to a much wider social problem.
As a matter of fact, here in Dallas, if you lived in a specific zip code, it tells you what your life expectancy can be, even if your zip code is just a few miles away from another zip code that will determine a much higher life expectancy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, I can see that definitely being applied to other areas as well, for sure. But yeah, connecting kind of like that local sense to the global in its own way. And then ultimately too, one of the interesting things, and this is really something we might dive a lot deeper into, especially as we're talking about research, is that last point about how all people of color are underrepresented in clinical trials. And there's a lot of different factors that have gone into that. But yeah, it's something that's very startling, and it raises questions as evidence-based practitioners. If we're supposed to drive a lot of our decisions, whether it be in clinical decision-making, business decision-making, librarian decision-making, and we're supposed to depend on evidence to inform that, um, who is being represented in the evidence, and who's getting left behind, who's getting omitted, and whose voices are not necessarily being heard. And so that's raising a lot of important questions and issues that we really need to address, especially within the research landscape. So yeah, I think with that, we can move on to what can we really do? So one of the things we really want to address is really providing a framework that we can really kind of rely upon to really guide our research. This is not necessarily going to be the single guiding point that you have to rely on, but it's definitely an important one. It has been, been built on across decades and even centuries, arguably, maybe in different names, but ultimately the current iteration is known as critical race theory. And it has been raised a lot in national discourses, and it has had different, let's say, perspectives or different interpretations of what exactly is critical race theory. And so even though we probably don't have nearly enough time to really cover all the bases of what critical race theory is and its own diversity of different applications, because even with critical race theory, it's not necessarily just one theory. There's many offshoots that have developed. But we can hopefully introduce you at least to a little bit more about it. And even if you want to follow up and really learn more, we definitely have some resources to share. I know Esther and I definitely are particularly interested in this particular domain. So essentially, critical race theory, even the name is implying a theoretical lens. It's also, just as importantly, a methodology. It's a methodology, as kind of the quote goes, for helping investigators remain attentive to equity while carrying out research, scholarship, and practice. So yeah, so you can immediately see that it's not only talking about a research lens, but also a practitioner lens as well. So there's been a lot of important discussions being held as to how we can readily apply it in practical situations as well. And I think as evidence-based practitioners, we're kind of meeting the divide between research and scholarship, and then also practice and application. And particularly as critical race theory, as the name also suggests, it specifically wants to focus on issues of racial equity. Although we'll talk about how there have been criticisms towards that, in the sense that maybe that's not enough, or what do we really mean by racial equity as it regards to other communities and other groups and other individuals, and especially applying that intersectional lens. So we'll talk about that. But is there anything you want to add to this before I move on to a little bit more of the specific principles here, Esther?
Just underscoring that critical race theory is, yeah, it means different things to different people, just as you said, just to underscore that.
Definitely. And it's had a really complex history as well in terms of where it kind of started. Even though critical race theory in its current iteration kind of began in legal studies, it's been readily applied in a bunch of other different fields, and it's probably where you've seen a lot of different offshoots, a lot of different interpretive applications to it, especially when it comes to like education, when it comes to philosophy even, and social justice in this case. But even now with health sciences, actually, if you look at the health sciences literature, critical race theory is actually starting to see a lot of emergence in that regard, probably in the last like maybe 5 to 10 years, at least from my last look at the literature.
Yeah.
So it's still kind of a very infant stage of its own application in health sciences. So it's also kind of exciting in that sense, because you might be, if you're really interested in exploring critical race theory in your own research, you might be forging new pathways of how it can be applied. So it's pretty exciting in that sense. So really, beyond just the overall description of what CRT or critical race theory is, there are certain principles that are applied to critical race theory that it kind of adheres. So even though there are many offshoots of critical race theory, they typically share many of these same principles or same assertions. One being the centering in the margins. Essentially, with centering in the margins, that's really what it's trying to talk about, is really helping to focus rather than on the dominant narratives that we've kind of had about what justice is, what equity is, and what normal is even, or like in terms of different issues like what is education, health, and all that. Really what centering in the margins is providing a new focus or renewed focus on underrepresented, underserved populations, in this case, racial minorities, or BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so really honing in and like uplifting those particular voices, those particular experiences, because in a lot of ways that how research has been, especially medical research, if you look at it historically and contemporarily, it has focused on a very white male type of perspective. And that's also reflected in how like even the representation of clinical trial samples has been predominantly white male, and particularly cisgender male, I should probably specify in that sense too. And then also with critical consciousness, it's really just having that kind of critical lens to everything in terms of how we're measuring things, how we're operationalizing or defining, and really applying a very race conscious perspective to it, really honing in like how are the issues or how the health conditions or anything that you're kind of wanting to investigate, how is race, and probably more importantly, how is racism playing a role in that sense? Because as we saw, even with like, pregnancy and birth, or even depression and anxiety, they may have systemic links to something of a greater social problem when it comes to racial discrimination and so on. And then we also have experiential knowledge. This is also kind of related back to that centering in the margins and really appreciating, valuing, validating the narratives of underrepresented and underserved BIPOC populations.
I think for me, one of the things about experiential knowledge is that conversation we had early in the presentation where we all talked about how we're experts in different things. And as a woman, I know that there are times that somebody will question my authority over something. And I know now, after learning about critical race theory and about feminist studies, that I have a right to my feelings, and I have a right to knowing what I know. And I know things as a Chicana that someone else might question because it's not in the dominant culture. And so experiential knowledge is, it seems like just normal advice, but it is like one of these very strong pillars that holds up the principles of critical race theory.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, it kind of expands what exactly do we mean by knowledge, and kind of, not necessarily adhering to the idea of objective knowledge, that a lot of the information, knowledge, research that is conducted and created and produced can also have embedded with experiences when it comes to like emotions even as well. And other types of facets of the human experience that statistics may not necessarily alone be able to explain, that we may need to consider other alternative methodologies and other types of understandings of what knowledge is. So, and we'll actually be kind of exploring that to an extent later in this session as well. So, no, well said, Esther, for sure. Do you actually want to tackle one of these other ones if you want, if you'd like?
I just, if I could talk about intersectionality,
Yeah, go for it.
I would like to discuss that we have many experiences that we have so many facets to us. And if you belong to more than one group, you might be a single parent, you might be married, you might be a homeowner, you might be homeless, you might be identify as female, you might identify as asexual, non-gendered, you might be an immigrant, you might be third generation American, you might have parents that were low income or high income, and all of these things kind of play into that experiential knowledge. But there's a reason why intersectionality was coined by a Black woman, and it's because in the past, those experiences were not valued, recorded, and I do have a friend who is a Chicana researcher. She interviewed her mother for a oral history project, used that oral history, that recording to quote in a book, and then that book has now been quoted by other people. That's the value of intersectionality and experiential knowledge.
Perfect. Yeah, I love that. And we did do a session, like I mentioned earlier, this month about intersectionality and really kind of honing in what exactly that is. But I think Esther summarized it really well, in the sense that, rather than trying to talk about like a race problem here or a gender problem there, a lot of the times is those problems are deeply intersecting with each other, influencing each other, bouncing off one another, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony, towards privileging you in some contexts, and maybe providing some disadvantages or barriers or challenges that you face in a whole different context or a different situation. So yeah, we just have all these multiple overlapping identities that kind of shape our lived experience when it comes to our access to healthcare, access to education, but not just access, but also our role in there when we navigate as an expert per se, maybe as a professional as well. So even as researchers, as evidence-based practitioners, we're coming in with our own intersecting identities. And they all come into play with other people's as well. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing that, Esther. And to add to that, a lot of the times, the reason why we really have a hard time articulating these like complex of movements and intersections with all of our different identities is because we kind of face this issue of ordinariness, which is another principle of CRT. The idea that these different identities, particularly when it comes to race and racism, just don't get acknowledged. Probably more so for people who don't necessarily have to experience it as a disadvantage, particularly someone like myself who is white, who is a cisgender male, who is hetero, and all of that. I do get loaned and conferred certain advantages, and I don't really see myself being privileged in that sense, or at least I don't anymore now. I'm much more aware of it. But I'm still getting privileged in that sense, like in terms of my being able to advance in my career or getting validated for certain ideas or initiatives maybe I try to go through. Both as previously as a student or even as a professional now. And really a lot of those types of factors kind of get hidden, or at least they're just not talked about. They're not actively addressed. And even how with research, how it typically frames race and gender, a lot of times when you kind of talk about like health sciences, kind of just gets framed as more of a controlled variable, but not necessarily being the forefront of the discussion of that particular research topic. You know, it's just kind of being controlled but it's and measured, but it's not really being actively talked about in the writing of the research, or even in the way the research question was articulated. So really it's become much more important of how can we draw those connections more to the surface and really talk about them. And then lastly, social construction of race. This is essentially kind of, it's probably the heart of CRT, and as well as other social theories, much like CRT, is the idea that, or the assertion that when we talk about race, when we talk about gender, when we talk even about class and stuff like that, they're not necessarily just natural byproducts. They are byproducts of our own social interactions with each other. They're built on relationships and other behaviors and actions that we take, on the policies that are written and enforced, and the institutions that are developed and ultimately shaping our kind of experience. And so as a result, one of the things about this is that because it's not necessarily something like biological per se, or physiological, or inherent to us in some other capacity, it means that they're not stable, that they can change, and which invites opportunity for us to actually work on them, rather than just saying, well, that's just the way things are. We can actually address them and really examine them and really improve on them, and hopefully dismantle a lot of the inequities that are present in society. But yeah, with that, before I move on, Esther, did you want to add anything as well?
Well, as far as social construction of race, I mean, all I can say is that so many things, I just feel like, honestly, so many things are a construct, you know. Do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. And sometimes, you know, I do feel like gender itself is constructed. I feel like, obviously, race is constructed. I pass as white, and so that feels constructed. But we do have the ability to name things and to name our experiences.
Yeah, love it. And actually, funny enough, or not funny enough, but coincidentally enough, we're actually going to be talking more about gender, or at least focusing on that in another session. I believe it's actually a session after this one in a couple of weeks. So if you want to join that one, feel free. But we'll talk about that one to more extent. But we'll definitely be talking about gender and social class and everything like that in relation to race in this sense too, because it is important. We can't just necessarily isolate race and racism by themselves away from all these other social inequities that we're also facing. They're all, again, connected in some way, and in different ways depending on the situation and the person and all that. But with that, we can move on to Esther's part here in terms of what is
Yeah.
dominant culture.
You know, I just think it's so important to name things. As you know, I do believe that clear communication is just so important. And as Mr. Rogers said, if you can feel it, then you can talk about it. And I can feel dominant culture, but I can't always name it. So for just, you know, to clarify what this is, because it comes up a lot. Dominant culture is the group of people in a society who hold the most power and are often, but not always, in the majority. So for example, in the United States, people who are white, middle class, Christian, and cisgender are part of the dominant culture. They're in charge of institutions. Institutions exist everywhere. Systems exist everywhere. And the people that are in charge of these institutions have established behaviors, they have established values, and they have traditions that are considered acceptable and the norm.
Yeah, I love it. And again, this is kind of reinforcing that whole social construction of race and equity and everything like that, or inequity, as we're talking about too. And also to keep in mind too is that the identities that Esther kind of references in terms of like living in the United States, being white, being middle class, being Christian, those are all very specific identities that are all kind of intersecting with each other. So to be all of those at once is a very specific set. And that's probably the people who probably have the most to benefit from the dominant culture, but not everyone who's necessarily white necessarily has all the same types of privileges here, depending on if they are trans or maybe they are among the like working class or another religion entirely, or not even living in the U.S., depending on where they're at, if they're living in the global South per se. And so on. And so ultimately, people can have a mixture of either privileged identities that allow them to kind of proceed through society without as many challenges. And then there's other identities that kind of are burdened with certain inequities or barriers or challenges. And sometimes we can face a mix of that, depending on where we're coming from. So yeah, so in that sense, thank you, Esther, for defining what exactly is dominant culture and really reinforcing that whole social construction of what we're kind of talking about here. And so with that, we're actually going to talk a little bit about actually applying CRT or just in general anti-racist frameworks to really enhance our research. So how can we actually put anti-racist frameworks into practice when we're out in the field researching? And ultimately, what we're going to describe here is not necessarily exhaustive. Again, like I said, it's increasingly expanding, increasingly developing, and you can even play a part in that yourself as well when you're doing any type of research or any type of work in that area. But here's some common ways that it can show up. One is by rejecting essentialism. So if you're not familiar with what essentialism is essentially, no pun intended, but it's basically referring to a frame of thinking that tries to show how things are inherent or somehow natural in some way, and being kind of like fixed and very predictable. Like in the sense of like rigid, yeah, that'd be another great word. And like one way we could say that is through biology and physiology, in the sense that because you may have a certain combination in genetics, you are predisposed, or it's going to be inherent to you that you're going to face certain things maybe later down because you have a certain type of risk factor. And ultimately,
a woman, a Mexican woman, my dad's girlfriend actually, from a much older generation in Mexico, majored in chemistry, but her professors at the university said, well, women can't do science. And so he would just guess her grade without looking at her assignments. That would be some essentialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be a great example of that. It's the idea that just because you are of a certain identity or anything like that, it's inherent that you won't perform as well, or maybe you'll perform better because, like we say, like because I'm a cisgender male, I would perform better in that particular field. So yeah, so there's a lot of different essentialist arguments and conceptualizations that we might hold to us that we don't really think of them in that sense. And even when we talk about health, it might be explained that, well, the Black community is experiencing more heart disease because they have certain, physiological and biological factors, but not really necessarily connecting it beyond that to other greater issues that might be involved, like we were talking about with depression and anxiety. We could essentialize it as being, well, it's just because there's neurochemical imbalances or some other type of explanation that kind of just reduces it down to a very neat and tidy explanation But, you know, as some research has been showing, is that no, it's actually much more complex than that, and that the mental health of the Black communities is also shaped in part by the experiences they face as a result of racism and similar types of structures like that. So really, when we talk about essentialism here, like how do you reject essentialism in your research is really in the way that you're articulating your question. That is definitely one way of doing it. If your question is not really acknowledging certain factors, like when it comes to like, say, like, you know, Blacks have, like say your hypothesis or your question is talking about like, do Blacks have higher risks or have higher incidences of heart disease than whites? That could be a very, a very off-the-cuff type of question. But because the way your question is framed, it's not really necessarily acknowledging those potential factors, or maybe you might miss out on those factors because of the way you articulate it. You might just more focus on the idea of just like simple statistical analysis of like those physiological and biological factors, and not really regard like where they're living or the racialized experiences that they're facing and anything like that in comparison to white communities. So yeah, so really that's one of the important things about rejecting essentialism, going beyond just having these very over-reduced explanations of like how things are and why they are. So, but yeah, with that, is there any particular questions that might be kind of asked here in terms of essentialism? I'm going to assume we're probably on the same page, but also another thing to consider is like also how are you operationalizing or defining those type of variables like race and gender and so on. Like if your question or if your variable about gender, for example, and you're kind of reducing it to like male, female, and then other, what is that really saying? You know, are you really like, are you adhering to this kind of like biological notion of what gender is? And like just the very binary aspect to it. And even with like race too, like how are you defining race in that sense too? So some important things to kind of consider when you're coming up with variables, when you're coming up with questions, and when you finally do your methodology and final write-up. What kind of story are you essentially telling here? And with about stories, one of the other important aspects to anti-racist research is the value of counter narratives. So like we talked about the centering in the margins, we talked about experiential knowledge, and ultimately really just trying to go beyond, again, those like essentialist, very over-reduced explanations of why things are, especially when we're talking about health sciences and health and well-being of our communities. We really want to explore the complexities of what's really happening. And perhaps quantitative methodologies are not enough. Maybe statistics don't necessarily give you the whole picture. They're giving you a slice of it, a really good inside look into it, but it's only until you really dive into the beneath the surface and really explore like why exactly is this happening, do we get a better picture, especially when we're like, say when we were talking about like heart disease or mental health. If we were just going by statistics, we might only reveal like, oh, well, the mental health of Black communities is somehow, in other words, like less or not as healthy than other groups. But beyond those statistics, we don't really know why. And we might be, therefore, just having to adhere or rely on these like very reduced explanations about it. And so with these counter narratives, we're really wanting to explore the experiences, explore the voices of the communities that we're working with. And some of the ways that have been kind of positioned as anti-research is valuing qualitative as well as mixed methods research as well. It's not to say that quantitative doesn't have its role. It definitely does, especially when it comes to getting funding, especially because quantitative methodology is typically valued more, especially in scientific fields and even among funding realms. but it also gives you a much more generalizable impact or assessment of what's happening. But with the qualitative methodologies, interviews, ethnography, and so on, you can probably get a lot more nuanced exploration as to what is going on and why it's happening, especially from the voices directly from the community themselves. And I'll also move on to, with that actually, exploring diversity within. So what does that mean? So essentially, a lot of times with health research, it's been often within a very, again, kind of a binary oppositional framework. It often tries to do comparisons between, say, like a community of color, like maybe the Black community, and it almost does like a versus with the white community. And even though that definitely has its own value, because then we can see those disparities that are happening, if we really only limit research only to that, we're only just seeing this very binary look at it, and oftentimes it also reinforces how the white community can be almost like the universal standard, because like if they're excelling and the Black community is not, then it could be framed that the Black community is somehow deficient in some way, which is not necessarily the story we really want to be exploring. And that's probably not going to be the case, because there's probably different reasons as to what's happening there. And also the other important thing is, well, what about the importance of actually exploring the diversity within the community? Because we can't just put all Black folks into one category as if they all experience the same thing. As Esther was really like doing a well-said description of it, well, what about as Black women? What about as someone who's a Black working class, who is trans Black? And all the different diversity of identities that are intersecting with within the community. So we might be missing out, only if we focus just on the aspect of race, we might be missing out on those nuanced explorations of what's happening with the Black trans community, what's happening with the Black women or cisgender women community, and so on. So if we're not really exploring those types of nuances within the community, we might be missing something here. Because, and again, some people might be getting left behind, even when we're doing some equitable work. Afro-Latinos, yeah, that'd be a great one. And actually that has a lot of controversy to it, as well as from what I've learned is like what it means to be Afro-Latino. I know there's a lot of differences in experiences that they can have versus someone who is identifying as Black or someone who's identifying as Latino. So even like questions about their own legitimacy of their own identity has been kind of questioned from what I've seen. But yeah, so with that, Esther, I think this is your part here.
Yeah, so the kinds of questions that are asked by researchers are often influenced by their own personal experience. And, so we bring with us into the field whatever experiences we've had. And that's what naturally happens. As a Chicana, I can bring in that conversation. But if I'm surrounded by other people that don't have my experience, it's a minority point of view, and so there might be less support for it. However, the more of us that are asking these questions, the better the research is going to be.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of draws back
the stronger, the stronger the research. Not better, the stronger.
Yeah, exactly. A much stronger, much more nuanced type of focused type of question. And I think that's kind of what we were kind of at first kind of introducing. I think you nailed it right here in terms of how that can really.
One of the things you said early in the presentation, Matthew, is how you were an optimist. And I think that, like Barack Obama says, that the arc of right skews, like the arc of history skews towards justice. And I think that and that's one of the things I love about the new, like the younger generations, especially the people that are hear that our students is how much they value authenticity. That's definitely a value that I've grown to hone. And that kind of authenticity is what comes out when we do ask genuine questions when we're in the field of doing research.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. And yeah, I definitely like the idea of like that, the history is, constantly progressing towards this ideal, I guess would be the word for it, of justice. And I think it's just important for us, though, to just remain on the path because there is a lot of pushback. There's a lot of scaling back, even with the civil rights movement. Historically, even though there was a lot of momentum with that and it came with a lot of changes, but over the last few decades, a lot of things have reverted back and in some ways are worse or just as bad, just in certain areas of issues.
While other things have improved and continue to
Yes.
get better.
Oh yeah, so yeah, exactly. And so it's just an ongoing practice. I think that's kind of what I was stressing, and also I think Esther poignantly said on her own end as well. And even with medical research and health sciences, even though we've gotten extremely better, one of the things actually I wanted to talk about with essentialism is how medical research was a perfect example of essentialism gone like to the extreme, because historically, even with anatomy, as I'm sure if you're learning about it now or even as a professional, the history of anatomy is very, very murky, because a lot of the recent developments in anatomy when it came to the early 20th century was unfortunately marred by gross atrocities when it came to like Nazi Germany and even in other places where they used anatomical sciences to try to prove that Black people and other people of color were inferior by either autopsying their bodies, trying to get measurements of their cranial or their brains and all that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of abuses that came about that. And luckily, we're not experiencing that now per se, like as to that extreme, but it still definitely exists. Actually, in 2004, I just recently read about how a native tribe had donated blood samples to a health researcher team, and it was supposed to be for, I believe, diabetes. Like it was supposed to kind of like trace issues of diabetes. But what wasn't consented was that the health researchers also used those same samples to investigate incest and schizophrenia within the tribe, and those were taboo topics, especially for the tribe. And the health researchers did not ask at all for consent, did not inform in any way. And there was a huge legal case. I believe it's been recently resolved, and there was quite a bit of a fine on that, and the samples were eventually returned to the native tribe. But again, like those issues definitely exist, for sure. Yeah, it definitely was awful in that sense. But again, those are some issues that we need to really work on as researchers. So I know we're kind of near the end of our time, so I'm going to move on to also Esther's thing here as well about agency. I think this is so appropriate, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is something I have learned from the students at the University of St. Augustine about patients' rights, but not just patients' rights. Like all of us have agency. And the word agency is used to mean the capacity of an actor. An actor would be any person to make a purposeful choice. In literature, agency is shown in a character that is self-driven. All of us, and like that tribe, unfortunately, they had to resort to law in order to show their agency. Otherwise, the researchers weren't seeing them as agents with their own ability to self-drive. And agency does imply freedom and capacity. This is in contrast with perceptions of influence or actions driven by other actors. In this case, so apropos, driven by the researchers. Agents in the end are people who can act.
Definitely. And I think even to that point too, I think even you had mentioned it too, is that even the research subject has agency in this case. And it's the importance of that relationship between researcher and research subject that is so crucial. And I think unfortunately though, sometimes in research, you know, the framing is all on the researcher as having the agency, while the research subject is just under investigation and kind of like this very disconnected phenomenon that we're investigating. But ultimately, yeah, they have their own lived experiences, their own practices, their own knowledge that they can share. And I think that it's definitely important that there be better collaborative partnerships between the two, rather than this kind of sense of like the researcher being this like third party objective presence that shouldn't be influenced by the community that it's investigating, but perhaps it should. Perhaps there needs to be a better accountability in that sense as well. So with that, Esther, yeah, I know we only have a couple of minutes, but feel free to take your time with explaining this.
I can say this very quickly. One of the things worth noting is in the APA style guide, they have addressed how to use inclusive language as far as age, disability, gender, and sexual orientation. In addition, APA does distinguish participation research. Those researchers should have read this first. Socioeconomic status and intersectionality. So that's right there in your APA guide that you have probably already purchased for class or is available at the library.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's another really important thing, especially from our students and faculty who are not only having to conduct the research or, you know, practicing this type of scholarship, but also having to do the write-up of like, what kind of voice am I going to apply to the research? Because we might, again, have this idea of the objectivity, but a lot of the times that research, that objective research language might be missing out on all these nuances, these complexities, and really kind of leaving out the voices of the research subjects who were crucial to the very research study that you're probably conducting. So, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing those resources as well.
I think we covered this, so we can move on. Just to credit Kimberly Crenshaw with the term, coining the term intersectionality, as well as Dr. Bishop, who coined the thought of mirrors and windows, and Corinne Duvis, who coined the term own voices. And to credit to the Black women who have influenced our research, that really, like, these terms are weaponized against people that are outside of academia. However, they belong to the people that are living these experiences.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think not enough credit has been said about the Black feminist movement, in particular from Black women scholars. And a lot of times it's unfortunately been usurped in a lot of ways by white scholars, or at least been more validated and popularized by white scholars, and kind of leaving out the credit for Black women, particularly if we even talk about race. When we talk about it's a very famous article about the invisible knapsack of white privilege. And it was written by a white woman, and it became much more popular than to talk about white privilege, even though Black women had been talking about it for decades and even centuries. So, you know, those are definitely important nuances that we really need to consider, even as our own as researchers, you know, the privileges that we can have being the author of certain stories, certain narratives, and what gets reinforced. But yeah, I think that was pretty much, yeah, near the end of it. So,
yeah.
So
we love talking about this.
Yes, we do.
Please email us, find us on library chat, come by the San Marcos or the Dallas campus library if you're one of our students. If you're studying this, we really want to help you with your research.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And we can even identify certain resources that might be helpful because unfortunately, yeah, as we've talked about, there is a serious underrepresentation of these communities. And even with our exhaustive databases and such, there are limitations to them because of that, just in terms of what is being published, what is being written on. But we can definitely help you with certain techniques or strategies or resources that might be helpful on that end. So, and like Esther said, we love talking about this. So if you ever want to just chat with us about it, we're more than happy to do so. But with that, we won't take up much more of your time. If you'd like, I did share a link to our survey. It's just a really quick survey. It gives us a really helpful feedback on how we can improve this session for the next time. So for others to enjoy. But, and also the recording will be made available fairly soon, actually, probably by the end of this week. And we'll send the link over to you once it's ready. But thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Esther, for co-facilitating with this with me. It's always a pleasure doing it.
Matthew, you inspire me.
And ditto.
You inspire me so much.
Ditto. But with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening or night, depending on where you're at.